And we're starting.
Well, thank you all for coming. Oh, I'm supposed to do this, right? It doesn't work. Well, anyway, so I'm not going to talk about water, despite the fact that Al thought I would be talking about water. I talked about water last year, and this year I want to talk about DNA, and I'm going to talk about, like John did, the science, conventional science with a twist. Although I am technically a biochemist by training, I'm going to really talk about the esoteric properties of DNA, but mix it with the conventional approach. So this will be a prelude for what Dan's going to talk about. I'm kind of like an etheric biologist, and he's an etheric engineer, so he's going to be talking about DNA this afternoon, but this will hopefully be a good background. So we've got it all planned out. I'm not talking about water, sorry. Okay, so there's my contact information. And one of these buttons will go to the next slide. So Dan always talks a lot about the heart. And Dan and I first met at HeartMath, maybe, or was it before in Long Island? Yeah, a long time ago, anyway, right, for many years. I was working at the Institute of HeartMath. Actually, it was a great story because we had some very elegant scientists, including that Rein researcher, Carl Pribram. Right, so here's Carl Pribram over here and Dan Winter over here, and they're trying to talk to each other. Completely different language, and I'm in the middle, and I'm acting as a translator for Dan's language into, he could understand Carl, but Carl couldn't understand him, so it was fun. But anyway, so in the honor of our mutual interest in coherence in the heart, I just thought I would mention a little bit about my own research, because I worked there for 3 years at the Institute of HeartMath and did all the DNA research way back in the 90s, I guess. So although this is 30 years old, it's still, and I don't really talk about it these days, since I'm here and Dan's here, I get to talk about this again. So I guess the first point is that, well, this is cool. I'll show you what the next slide is going to be. Yeah, cool, sorry.
You're in the future.
I'm going to talk, never mind. So we were studying, I actually left Stanford University to go work at the Institute of HeartMath because they were studying positive emotions. And I thought and the beneficial effects on the body. And I was so impressed by that, that I literally left Stanford University, and that was the end of my academic career. So this started me off on this whole journey of alternative energy medicine. So they were probably one of the first to actually measure the coherence associated with positive emotional states using the EKG or ECG. And in particular, they showed that there was coherence in, I don't have a pointer, a laser pointer. What is it?
Mouse.
The mouse might work for you. No.
This is going to be a great audience. I will try to crack a few jokes. Anyway, so the point is that positive.
It's there, Joe. It's just hard to see.
Yeah, it was there.
Oh, you can't
It's
see
just
it?
really hard to see.
Oh, can't see
There
it.
you go.
Oh, an arrow. Oh, an arrow. Oh, okay.
You can try.
There you go. An arrow. Oh, that's the next slide. It's blowing my surprise. There it is. Okay, never mind. So that's what happens with appreciation and love and compassion and frustration and anger generate very incoherent EKG patterns, measuring the heart rate variability and the fluctuations therein. Okay, now we can go backwards. We like to do that around here, right? Backwards in time. Okay. So, and then further than that, we were studying the effects of these emotional states on the immune system. My background being biochemistry. And we were the first people to show that positive emotions actually stimulate the immune system, because at that time, all the scientific literature was focused on negative emotions and what stress does to the immune system and to the body. So I was so excited to do this kind of work that I left Stanford. In the old days, it was called psychoneuroimmunology. Now it's called mind-body medicine. And it was really great stuff, way ahead of its time. And the other important thing to note that they also measured that, starting to measure the EEG and the brain waves. And they were also the first people to show that the changes in the hull, what an angel precious are. Right, I could do that. Except it doesn't work.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Okay, so if I stand in front of it, you can see the arrow. If I stand over here, I can't see the
No. There it is. It's not bad.
Well, I can't see it, so that doesn't do me any good. Back to the point is that they were the first people to show that the brain changed before the heart changed. That the brain waves actually control and regulate the heart. No, I have that wrong. The other way, backwards. The heart waves change first, and then the brain waves. The heart controls the brain. Right. And that when you go into these positive emotional states, there is a convergence of the electrical activity at 0.1 hertz, which we talked about earlier today. So, in the interest of congruity. Okay, so we saw that. Now, my point here is that I want to talk. Sorry, this is jumping all over the place. Okay, so now I want to talk about DNA, this is my model, which is an extension of the original ideas at HeartMath and Dan and the community. So what I'm proposing here is that it's the coherence in the, well, this part's Dan's stuff really, but Winfrey was one of the first people to actually show that the radiation from the heart is in the shape of a toroid. So the idea here is that coherence in the heart, positive emotions generates the coherence, generates the toroid. The toroid then radiates from the heart and affects the DNA. There we go. Now you can go home. That's the bottom. So what does it do to DNA? Well, it changes the shape of the DNA, or the technical word is conformation, so that it goes from a helix to a toroid, as in the next slide, which is, no, I'll get this right, yeah. There. It goes from a helix to a toroid. Now, the toroid has actually been shown and published in the biological literature that DNA exists as a toroid. But it's not this kind of a toroid, because there's a lot of electrical engineers here. It's a toroid that the strands of DNA are circumferential. That's a big word for people who don't speak English, but that means it goes around, not that way. So this is basically what I'm proposing, that this transition occurs in response to a coherent energy from the heart. Then the DNA is activated. So activation of DNA is a big thing in America. There's a lot of people going around to 12 strands, and you got to activate your DNA. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means from a conventional biological point of view, because there are not 12 strands of DNA, there are 2 strands of DNA. And everybody asks me that question, and this is a great opportunity to share a little bit about that. One of the important things that I've done to support this whole model is measuring the shape of DNA, the helical shape of DNA. So the helix itself can wind and unwind, and I did experiments back in the 90s showing that human intention can change the shape of the DNA, that depending on the intention. If the intention of the healer is to wind the DNA, it would do that. And if the intention was to unwind the DNA, it would do that. So that was an important observation. And then at HeartMath, we showed that that only occurs when the ECG is coherent. When the healer is generating the coherence and the toroid, then the DNA changes. So that's kind of the key background information to move on to.
Just a real short summary there. At that situation, where Glen showed the change in heart rate becoming an orderly curve, that was not my idea originally. HeartMath pursued that. That was beautiful.
They did that,
yeah. But where they take the full EKG and do the spectrum analysis for coherence, that was my idea originally. And I taught them how to
do that.
Yes.
Right.
So, and that's where it was those harmonics. And I proposed to them that the word is coherence. And you wouldn't believe me for years until I proved the word was coherent.
So that was Dan's contribution. And this, I just shared my contribution. So now we can go on to activating DNA. Okay, so because that's such a hot topic these days. So one way to activate DNA is to turn on its biological functions. Well, DNA does a lot of things, and it's hard to predict how raising your consciousness to a higher level would affect DNA. But it could affect gene expression, which means how DNA makes proteins. So the dogma in molecular, and we have at least one molecular biologist I talked to here, the dogma in molecular biology is that DNA makes RNA and RNA makes the proteins. So gene expression means the ability of DNA to make specific proteins. You turn on specific proteins, you can actually get the body to do things it didn't do before if those proteins were not there or not turned on. So that's a reasonable way to activate the DNA. Okay. So, and the DNA does a lot of things like self-repair is a particular interest to me, and because it's directly related to the electrical conductivity of the molecule, and then we're going back into the electrical domain, and we'll talk more about that later. But we do know that electromagnetic fields turn on all of those three functions of DNA. So that's a reasonable jump to say, well, maybe the biofield and the mind can do the same thing. Okay, so that's one way to activate DNA. The other ways to activate, I'm just going to use my finger. Other ways to activate DNA would be to activate the codes of DNA. Now, this is the 12-strand stuff that they talk about. Another word that has been channeled, instead of using the word strands, is layers, which kind of makes more sense to me because every molecule has an energy field around it, and that energy field can be in layers. Then we could turn on the quantum properties of DNA, which is a whole lecture in itself, or we could turn on the frequencies of DNA, which is something I've been measuring in my lab, which I'll talk about at the very end. Hopefully I'll have time. I'm blabbering away here.
Glen, can I 30 seconds, please? Just to be clear, we had our model, and Glen and I discussed this before he did this trial, actually, and we said that when the lower frequencies in the EKG phase cohered, those long waves were the mechanism of the braiding coherence, and I'm sure that's where Glen is going next, is recursive coherent braiding.
Of course.
So, and half of my talk this afternoon is gorgeous pictures. So, but just for right here, when the thread is braided into string, braided into rope, into fat rope, you have added an envelope of a longer wave, which if it's phase coherent, that braiding could be coherent. And that's where the idea of the next strand is, because if you recursively do that 12 times, and so then what we,
right.
Yes, so the long wave doesn't exist if the string is tangled up. But if it's braided in a big fat rope, then the long wave and the 12th strand exists. And we're going to talk about, we have pictures here. So the mechanism proposed was that these long wave onset phase coherence in the EKG, which is precisely what we're measuring, was the mechanism to organize that recursive braiding. And the mechanism by which the protein replication was controlled was The alignment of active sites was permitted only if you were inside or outside the braid. I'm done now.
Excellent, very good. I was not going to talk about that. That's why we're here together, talking about it.
I did my shot this afternoon.
There we go. This is a precursor.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. Okay.
Thanks.
So I want to talk a little bit more about toroidal DNA, because the shape of DNA is obviously critical.
And we have pictures of that too.
That's one way to activate the DNA, by changing its shape or its conformation. So here's a quote from a reference in 2005. I have a lot of quotes in here just to show you that the scientific community is talking about this kind of stuff. Not a lot, but you pull out a quote and put it in context, right? So this quote says that the DNA morphs into different shapes and structures alternative to the classical helix. Well, that would be the toroid. And as I said, these are actually electron micrographs, not so good in the light, but of DNA existing as a toroid. So biologists know this, but they have no idea what the function of a toroid is. Then in the 1990s, now this we have to discuss, because I published my theory of the function of toroidal DNA as an antenna to broadcast energies, and Dan was talking about the same stuff. I don't know who came first, the chicken or the egg.
I don't know.
But the point is that right around then, we were both talking about the same thing, synchronicity and all that stuff. Right? And then, 30 years later, the channelers now, I've got the same model, and but they added another twist. The new information is that the toroid spins, which I think is totally cool. Okay, so the main point here is that the function of, according to my model, is that the function of toroidal DNA is to emit a subtle energy field in the shape of a toroid, and that the physical toroidal DNA can act as a transducer and convert conventional electromagnetic energy into etheric energy. And that is because in the center of a toroid is this shape called a catenoid, which is in the physics literature. There's a reference there talking about transitions between discrete toroidal states. Of course, this is not biology, this is physics. But the point is that the toroid shape generates a toroidal field, and that the catenoid is the main thing here that we're talking about, which is also present in a wormhole. And the physics literature is full of, believe it or not, information about wormholes acting as converters of higher dimensional energy into electromagnetic energy and vice versa. And here's a depiction of that visually, and here's a quote from another article about higher dimensional catenoids as a complete minimal hypersurface in higher dimensional Euclidean space. Okay, great. So, but the important actually word here is hypersurface. But that's a word that physicists use to describe the mouth of the toroid. The mouth of the toroid up here. Believe it or not, they use that word in the physics literature. It's kind of cool. But anyway, so also in the physics literature, they talk about, in the astrophysics literature, they talk about toroidal plasmas, which we've been talking about for the last 2 days. There's a reference back in 1957, force-free magnetic fields. That means not an ordinary magnetic field, like a force field, but more like a potential field, which I'll talk a little more about. And then I came up with my theory way back then about what I call geometric resonance, which we did talk about yesterday, but we didn't quite give it that name. That there are resonance between these different shapes. That the energy, they can physically transform each other in this way, but that the energy between a vortex and helix and a toroid and a vortex, for example, allows for information transfer because the objects are very close to the same shape. It doesn't have to be exactly the same shape. So that was the concept that I proposed way back in the 90s. Okay. Now, back to the physics literature. Magnetic toroids are described in, this is the geophysics literature. The geomagnetic field around the Earth has magnetic toroidal fields. And they describe them in terms of spherical harmonics, which is a term we haven't heard yet, but understand. And it happens, right? And they also, believe it or not, use the word scalar to describe these magnetic toroids, but that's not the kind of scalar we talk about, I don't think.
Well, if the path of the DNA on the torus is the hypersphere or the Mobius, then in fact that could imply conjugate conversion to the longitudinal scalar at the center.
Okay, so that would be a mechanism to how that could occur. But in the, back to the physics literature, the field that describes these magnetic toroids is magnetohydrodynamics. And there's actually a lot of literature, and in summary, they describe these toroids as anti-symmetric, that they obey this differential rotation is one of the behaviors, and they act as a dynamo, and they have polarity reversal. All similar concepts that we talk about. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and that and they have the function in this geophysics community. They are actually proposing a function for the toroid to stabilize chaotic behavior. So that is kind of like coherence
And negative entropy.
and negative entropy. So the ideas that Dan and I have been talking about for 30-odd years are actually in the conventional physics literature.
And that concatenoid is actually our pine cones kissing noses.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, now, so back to the catenoid here, and the wormholes. This is another area in the physics community where they talk about transversable wormholes. That is to say that what happens when you go through it to the other side. And this is where they talk about the mouth and where they talk the throat, not the mouth, sorry. Sorry, it's the throat. Get it right. My anatomy here wasn't my good subject in school. That the throat is spherically shaped, and there are two kinds of throats, spherical ones and flat ones. And the flat ones are hypersurfaces, as I talked about before, and they can be concave or convex. So depending on which direction, the energy goes either in direction. Now, even Einstein, they use Einstein's field equations to describe the behavior of the wormholes in terms of exotic matter and energy, which I thought was quite interesting. And most interesting, the properties of the throat, negentropy and time lapse. Now that's different than time reversal, but it's similar, demonstrating that time doesn't have to only go forward in a linear.
Time is spin only, so the spin density down the vortex.
Right. So that's a little bit of physics. They actually use the term teleportation. So we are talking about pretty far out stuff here.
And we're going to be talking about portals later. So
This is an introduction to the physics of portals. Okay, right. Okay, so now let's talk about toroids in plasmas and get right down to the point here. This is also in the physics literature. And here's a particular article from 1969 about toroids and plasmas and the connection to radial electric fields. And we were talking about electric fields in the last lecture. And again, here's the properties. They're anti-symmetric, they're paramagnetic, they have a strong helicity, meaning like a helix, and they're talking about rotating plasmas and these properties associated with a rotating plasma, all in the physics literature.
So somebody just told me we should have had those pictures of dolphins using ultrasonics to throw around these donuts underwater.
Yeah.
They make, that would be the animation.
That would be great.
Yes.
That would be great. Next time I give this lecture,
Yeah.
maybe next year, because there's a lot of people here that were not here last year. Anyway, so let's go back to the electromagnetic toroids rather than plasma toroids. Because electrical engineers know all about toroids. They use this kind of a toroid in circuits and a lot. There's one particular article here which talks about how the toroid can actually generate a gauge field. A gauge field and conditioning electromagnetic fields into gauge fields. That's like converting a classical electromagnetic field into a kind of subtle energy. I mean, I don't have time to go into gauge fields, but it's complicated. And they're not ordinary electromagnetic fields. That's the point. So in this particular study, well, they're talking about the A field, which is a potential field, which is a kind of gauge field. And they mathematically modeled the shape of the A field that's generated from an electromagnetic toroid using opposing conductances 180 degrees out of phase. Does that sound familiar? Right. Okay. And the point again is that they describe the properties of these fields. This is again the physics literature words, but it's just interesting to see the words that they use, like self-duality, and we'll see a picture of that in a minute, and multiple connections, and they even propose the subatomic particles that are associated with these kind of fields, instantons. Right, okay, so here's a picture of the mathematical model of the two fields generated from a toroid, this one and this one. And the point is that in the middle, the magnetic field, the conventional electromagnetic field, is zero. But this potential field, subtle energy field, radiates from the toroid with opposing polarity and different phases. So that's kind of an important concept that we've been talking a lot about, phases and all that stuff. So this is right in that article. There aren't many like this, but I found this one. Okay, so now here's another article which was published in The Physics of Plasmas 9 years ago. Again, talking about magnetic hydrodynamics and counter-rotating vortices and plasmas. So this one article has it all covered, and it was from Greece. We have some people here from Greece, so here we go. This is an honor of you guys, right?
It's actually the same university I did my
Oh, really?
PhD.
It's the same?
Yeah.
All right.
Must be a very progressive university.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
To do your work and this kind of work.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Max Planck Institute,
Really?
the second person.
And yeah, so this is an interesting article. And again, they're talking in magnetic hydrodynamics and the properties of toroidal fields. And again, they're using the function, they're describing the function as stabilizing, which is what the previous article said. Again, electrostatic potential is not the A field, but it's the phi field.
Yeah.
So classical electromagnetic field is described in terms of the electric and magnetic components. But there's also the potential fields generated from the A and the phi, which are mathematical models, mathematical constructs, but the magnetic vector potential, and the phi, the electrostatic potential, are stuff that Bearden talked about, and Dan talks about, and I talk about, because it's the energy that underlies the classical electromagnetic field, which is a force field. It's a potential field, two of them, two different kinds. So it's the phi field, which, as distinct from the phi that we talk about here, that describes the properties of vortices created by, toroids created by counter-rotating vortices. So that's right there in the physics literature. Okay, not many. Okay, now there's another way to generate counter-rotating vortices, which Tesla used with his flat Tesla coil. Because what happens is the current comes in, goes clockwise, then it reaches the middle, and then it comes on the other side, it goes counterclockwise. So you have a clockwise and counterclockwise two coils in a flat geometry like that. So Tesla knew what he was doing, obviously. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about toroidal fields as type of subtle energy. So, I've already talked about the magnetic vector potential and the electrostatic scalar potential, which is where the word scalar comes from, but it's not so obvious that that's exactly the way we use the word scalar. But this is, again, in the straight physics. So these terms are all in the physics literature. Quantized electromagnetic fields are a electromagnetic field that acquires quantum properties. Spin fields, scalar fields, virtual energy, and plasma fields are all terms in the physics literature. I use the word subtle energy as an umbrella term because in honor of Bill Tiller, who actually first introduced that term. He's a good friend of mine. Okay, now, so then, of course, what I really want to talk about is the effects of these kind of energies on DNA, not ordinary electromagnetic fields. Now, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time, and I've been actually shown in my lab that all of these different kind of energies affect DNA. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but we're starting with plasmas, and in this particular lecture, I'm only going to talk about plasma energy, well, mostly, and its effects on DNA. This is all a big introduction to get to the experimental part, where I'm going to talk about the research in my own lab. Okay, so let's talk about the effects that these kind of subtle energies have on the body in contrast to a conventional electromagnetic field. A regular electromagnetic field is known to affect the ions in the body, calcium, magnesium. It can affect the electrons in the ions, but mostly it affects the behavior of the ions, whether it's the movement of the ions or the oscillation of the ions. Now, when an ion like calcium goes through the cell membrane, it actually doesn't go through like that, it spirals through. So that kind of supports what Dan was talking about yesterday. So we're creating a resonance between an electromagnetic field and this spiral motion.
And the frequency is 0.1 Hz.
What nobody studies, the people in the bioelectromagnetics society who study this phenomena with conventional electromagnetic fields, they never study less than 1 hertz for some reason. They start at 1 hertz and they only go up to, well, they go to gigahertz, but they never go less than 1 hertz. So they're missing the whole point. And they do not work with this kind of energy. This kind of energy is like, you know, in the conventional, so that's a universal symbol, right? So it turns out that I believe that subtle energy affects all of these different mechanisms. And that is why I believe that healing with this kind of energy is so much more important because it's working at this very fundamental level. These processes underlie all biochemical processes. So in essence, the conventional electromagnetic field only affects the biochemical processes, but the subtle energies like plasma fields affect the energy and the systems that underlie the gross behavior of electrons and photons in the body. Okay, so that's just an overview, my perspective. Okay. Are we ready to talk about the effects of toroids on DNA? I don't know, let's see. Maybe. Okay. Well, so I'm going to go back to this slide and look a little bit more on these properties here. So, for a little more detail. So, codes. Let's talk about codes. Well, everyone knows about the genetic code, which is just also called base pair codes. So, DNA is made of 4 bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, blah, blah, and they exist in a sequence which is called the genetic code. So it's a code. It's the sequence that makes a code. But in the biology literature, nonetheless, they also talk about digital codes, cyclical codes, binary codes, information codes, shape codes, which the shape of the DNA, error correcting codes, and even zip codes. I mean, like it's like what? Not really. Okay, so that's in the conventional scientific literature. Now, here's another area of science. It's called combinatorial chemistry, where they talk about this kind of stuff. And here's a quote from an article published in 1989. In any pattern in the sequence of bases or other things which correspond to a specific biological function. Okay, so that's a definition of a code. So we talked about base codes, and here's the nucleotide bases. But they're considered fixed. The genetic code is, that you get from your parents, you think you're stuck with it. But then they discovered that's not true, that there are these things called transposons, which actually allow one base to move in the sequence. And as soon as you move one base, you change the code, you change the sequence, and you change everything. So that kind of was, to me, one of the most profound observations in the field of biology. Okay, so that's the genetic code, which is kind of boring, really. But the more esoteric stuff is like a shape code. So here's a quote from an article which talks about the shape assumed in space and time, analyzed in terms of the superposition of thermal fluctuations. Okay, well, that's a fancy way to say, to define the shape, but I guess the magic word here is superposition, because that's a quantum property. So we're getting into more esoteric areas here. And here's the same article, they also define this in terms of spatial arrangements to create multi-dimensional molecular scaffolds, which is a real mouthful, but scaffold, these arrangements of the DNA molecule are now being made synthetically in this field called biotechnology, nanobiotechnology, because they're working with changing the shapes of our DNA. And DNA turns out to have all these amazing properties that the body may use, but the scientists are generating these things in a lab, which is the first step. Let's now move on to quantum codes. Got another more references here, but they describe this stuff better than I could, because it's like, just so you know, that they use words like self-assembly and nanostructures, multiple hierarchies of information. That sounds right out of Dan's mouth, right? But in the scientific literature. Codes embedded in the DNA sequence. That's a magic word, embedded, right? That Dan's been talking about years. Control the processes at the atomic level taking place at nanoscale. I mean, that's a mouthful, but that's what we're talking about here. So for me, it's very exciting to see the scientists talking about this stuff. And it helps validate what we're doing. Okay, now strands, well, Dan's already discussed and defined strands, but here's the scientific version where they're actually taking strands and putting them on top of nanoparticles called quantum dots. And so here's the different strands. And I just bring this up because in this article that I quote here from 2005, they say that the maximum number of strands they can do this with is 12. Well, that's bizarre, because they're all talking about 12-stranded DNA. What a strange coincidence, that magic number of 12. All right, just pointing it out. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about what my heart's really into, is frequency codes, because we've been talking a lot about frequencies and the magic of what frequencies do what. Well, if we knew what the frequency codes in the body were, then we could use those frequencies in the external devices to control the frequency codes in the DNA. So, they talk about, in this particular article, which I'll get to in a minute, they talk about space frequency codes and time frequency codes. And mostly these codes are not, this is not about DNA, but these codes are in the electrical system, in the nerves, because the nerve impulses travel at different velocities that we just heard about from John, at different speeds, and they're traveling through a nonlinear medium, and they describe these as phase synchronized, okay, magic word, phase synchronized. And then they're talking about cross frequencies. So you have a brain, and this is in the brain, not in the nerves per se. So you have a region, brain region here, and a brain region here. Well, they talk to each other using cross frequency codes that are phase conjugated. Does that sound familiar? Right. Okay. So here's a particular article where they talk about all this stuff, and they're talking about how the nerves affect the colostrum and the propagation of the nerves and the interaction of the nerves and the frequencies of the nerves, and they describe all this. And the magic words that they use in this article is nested frequencies. My God, I could imagine that. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because that's like, okay, here's another article that talks about nested synchrony in frequencies and oscillations of nerve cells. Okay, this is from Finland. We have people here from Finland as well as Greece. And all this, I got to say, all this really interesting work is not done in America or England. We've got British people here. It's done in these countries where obviously they're much more open-minded to these esoteric ideas. So, nesting of frequencies. Okay, got it, right. So they're talking about the dynamic behavior between two networks in the brain, which oscillate at different frequencies. And this article describes the synchronicity and the synchrony between these two regions. And when they're nested, their definition of nesting is that one network can modulate the other network. One set of frequencies can change the frequencies in the other region. And that's different than Dan's definition, but that's a technical definition in this particular article. And the point being that it's occurring between two different oscillating systems. The two systems can be two different regions of the brain, or it could be an external signal generator and an internal oscillating network in the brain, for example. And that is the point that they make, but I'm extending it a little bit here. So that is the scientific explanation, if you will, for how the Theraphi works, in a nutshell. It's right there.
And we would like to suggest that the concept of perfect nesting is always the same as perfect embedding, and in the climax form of that, the perfection of would be conjugation. And it would be then self-evident that that would be fractality perfected as well, which is the compression perfected.
Yeah.
So all concepts go to the same place. And the buzzword in physics today, entanglement, is the same thing.
Okay, well, I didn't get to that,
Yeah.
but okay, there we go. So that's the point, that this mechanism explains Dan's work right there in the conventional scientific literature. Okay, so that was the culmination of part one.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay.
Now we can move on to part two.
Color more grateful.
That was the introduction, okay.